All right, welcome to the relaunch of Grow Beyond Grades. This is our first live stream with the new format. Thank you, everybody who's joining us. So, the reason for this relaunch is one of the best parts of Teachers Going Gradeless was our regular Twitter chats. And it was a great place to build community, find people who are like minded, and, really get a chance to ask some questions, get support. So we're trying to rebuild that space in a way that's it's new, it's fresher. And so we're going to be coming to you live the first Sunday of every month at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. I am Dave Franjosa. I'm your host. I'm joined by
Michelle Cottrell Williams, here in a supporting role tonight.
All right. So one of the best parts about this community is that we meet so many great people and they support us in everything we do. And one of those companies is Got Feedback, and they are the reason we can bring this to you tonight. So we want to thank our sponsor, Got Feedback. And there are so many other Patreon members that help us do what we do, and we're just looking to expand the resources that we provide to you. So yeah, keep supporting us however you can. We really do appreciate it. So tonight we have a great guest with us. So this person has 3 decades of expertise in educational access. So I'm not going to steal his thunder. We're just going to bring him out here so he can tell us what that is, and his path in education. So I'd like to welcome Akil Bello.
Woo, woo.
Hey, how you doing?
All right, how's it going? Welcome, Akil.
Thank you.
So, can you just tell us a little bit about your journey in education and how you got here?
Sure. Let's see. My journey in education. I guess it starts in college. I was studying architecture at Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, and poor college kid decided I needed a part-time job. So I got a part-time job as a proctor at Princeton Review. And that introduced me into the world of test prep. Fast forward 10 years, I do everything that's possible to be done in test prep without taking a full-time job. And I start teaching more, start doing a lot of tutoring. Eventually, I launched my own company to do more programmatic work. So partnering with schools and nonprofits to help build their programs and create programs for various standardized tests. Eventually left that and moved into policy, and I'm currently the Senior Director of Advocacy and Advancement at FairTest, which is the National Center for Fair and Open Testing. And my primary work is to help decrease the overuse of standardized testing, help correct some of the misuse of standardized testing, and advocate for more limited use of standardized tests. That's the short story.
Nice. I think that's such an interesting kind of journey through the system of testing. And I'm curious if when I think about maybe you entering as a proctor in college, I would imagine you weren't really thinking about testing that much, except maybe you had taken a test to get into college, right? And I'm wondering how in the 30 years or so since then, your thinking around testing has evolved, whether it was based on the role that you were playing within it, or the amount of time you've spent in it.
Yeah, so it's an interesting journey to look back on, because I think my career basically has had 3 phases. Trying to help individuals with test, right? Being a teacher, you're helping one-on-one essentially, right? Whether it's a classroom or tutoring, it's kind of still you're helping one student to do better. And then I moved on to running a company, trying to help schools and institutions and organizations improve outcomes for students. So I've taken a level sort of up. Then I moved on to advocacy, still doing the same work, helping people understand, get past, deal with test. I think right now, but sort of the thread throughout all of it is recognizing that a lot of what we're told about assessments isn't quite accurate. the perception created around the specificity, the accuracy, all of those things around testing isn't quite accurate. So the through line of all my work is debunking the myths around testing, whether it's on an individual level or on a societal level.
So, okay. One of those myths, and I know you've written about this, in my mind, is learning loss. So, I know you have some thoughts on this. So, can you kind of tell us where does this come from? How does this fit into our conversation?
Yeah, so learning loss is an interesting term. And for me, it's so many of the catchphrases are problematic. They might start out right, but they become cliche, problematic, and they do more harm than good. Learning loss in part evolved from summer loss and summer melt, where it was an attempt to measure numerically what happened when kids were out of school. So learning loss sort of evolved from that same sort of thinking to measure how much kids lost during the summertime when they weren't in school, right? During the pandemic, it really picked up. I think it was a McKinsey report that gave us that phrase. I could be wrong onto which company sort of started it. But to me right now, essentially learning loss is the attempt to quantify in days or hours performance on standardized tests and how it differs from what they expected it to be, which is just weird to me, right? Like to say, to look at a standardized test, like it's standardized test performance loss, maybe, right? I'm not sure it means learning loss. Now we know the pandemic had trouble, but to boil it down to your performance on the test is what we've measured. So if you don't do as well on a standardized test, when you haven't taken one for 2 or 3 years, we're going to call that learning loss and the schools are failing. It's a really bizarre, reductive language that becomes problematic because of it forces policy solutions for the wrong problem.
Yeah, no, I completely agree there. And when you talk about learning loss, the reason people say it's like riding a bike. Once you learn something, it is not lost, right? So, like, if we're just thinking about that, and we're really looking from that deficit aspect of um, trying to plug holes that might not even be there, right?
Right.
It's opportunity lost. Okay, I can get behind that, but like learning, we're trying to quantify something that can't be quantified.
Yeah. And it's
You
it's
know,
really bizarre. When you look at some of the source material, like what are they quantifying? The report I remember specifically was I'm pretty sure it was like one of those McKinsey reports that was essentially we expected this math score. So if we take the difference between the expected math score and the actual math score, and then we break that down by days of school and months, they're doing all these weird quantifications of things that don't seem reasonable to me. Now I understand we have like we want to quantify things, but there's a line at which you should go, this isn't really meaningful, right?
Mhm.
Just because it's numeric doesn't make it meaningful. And I think it hides real conversations. Kids were out of school for 5 months. We know there's some things we wanted to teach them that we didn't. Like you don't need to try to quantify it to any level of specificity unless you're going to put money behind that and say, hey, for every month of learning loss, we're going to give you another extra $1 million. Then I'm all for it. Let's quantify it all day long. Right. But to quantify it only to be pejorative seems weird.
sure. And like, I'm not going to skip too far ahead, but like when we do that, that's where we get some challenges with equity. We're going to talk about equity in a bit, but when you start saying, all right, we need to accelerate learning, which is just learning loss with a different name, right? Like you're really opening up a lot of those problematic approaches to education. And so, how do we kind of talk about those things productively? Because look, it's real. There students that are in our classrooms are not doing things that students prior to distance learning came in knowing because they didn't have the same experiences. So what's the responsibility? Is it to the test? or is it to the child?
Right. Right. That's a huge and I think right now the response has been pretend nothing has changed
Mm,
and try to get the same test results as before. And I question both of those things. The pretend nothing has changed is bizarre. And why do we want them to do these narrow tests? Like, shouldn't we want more?
yeah.
To me, it just feels like it's such a narrow measure of success. I'm a big sports fan, and I keep trying to find the right analogy. I keep going back and forth whether it's like testing to me is a free throw contest to choose your best basketball player.
Hmm.
And I'm not even sure a free throw contest is right because that feels too skillful. It feels too relevant to the game. Like it'd be a dunk contest,
Mm,
something that's flashy and pretty to look at, but not really meaningful,
yeah.
right? But it does touch on the skills, right? So there's not nothing measured by test, but the hyper focus creates real problems.
Yeah.
All
Well, and
right.
I think when I hear people use learning loss a lot, I think the way that they're using it, it's as if they believe children and students have learned nothing.
Yeah.
Um,
But it's all the language they use. It's kids can't read, right? It's like they're like 12th graders can't read. I'm like, that's not true. There's no way on God's green earth that there's a 12th grader who's been passed through and cannot read. That would mean illiterate.
right.
You might mean not read up to your expectations. Well, let's say that, right? At least when they say 2 grades behind, it's quantified,
Hmm.
right? In a somewhat meaningful way, right? So I think a lot of this conversation is reductive language that creates reductive policy.
Mm,
Now, I mean, we can go down a lot of rabbit holes here. So when you talk about reading levels, just by the design of reading levels, half of the students we have are behind. So I mean, that's just the design of it.
No, what I
So
like is that the New York Times, the paper of record, the mark for all of our intelligentsia, is written on a 10th grade level. So if you tell me a 12th grader is 2 levels behind, I'm like, cool.
yeah.
They're your typical adult.
mhm.
like, like I don't know. I don't know how to really process that. I do understand, and I am concerned if you say we have an entire school where these 12th graders don't read like the rest of the 12th graders in the district.
Mm.
That's problematic, right? But some of those things like grade levels and they become reductive and lose meaning.
So okay, I guess this brings us to our next topic is test culture, right? Because a lot of this discussion stems from the amount that we test students and try to quantify this. So if we're always trying to see who's behind and what level they're performing at, is it proficient? Is it advanced proficient? Is it approaching proficiency? Right. So we're trying to get all of these measures. So where does this test culture come from, and what impact does it have on teaching and learning as we see it in our classrooms now?
Oh, I mean, that's a big question because I'm a little bit of a rabbit hole buff. So I go down all the rabbit holes.
You're
So
in good company.
where does the test culture come from? I mean, you can go all the way back to Horace Mann, right? He wanted standardized tests in the 1850s or whatever it was, but his intent was very different. His intent was let's test so we can improve curriculum and standardize curriculum across the growing number of common schools,
Mm.
right? That's not what we're doing anymore, right? We didn't hold to the Mann notion of standardized testing to improve curriculum. When Binet invented the intelligence test, it was let's create a test to identify those who need the most help, those who are developmentally behind, and give them extra support. Well, we haven't done Mann testing either, right? So they took the ideas from Mann and from Binet, and then that married to eugenicist belief in ranking and sorting and trying to find the top however you want to define it by these narrow measures, And that's the testing that we've doubled down on. We've doubled down on this kind of weird punitive testing where if you're not above average, that's somehow problematic. Like, it's just, like, to me, that's the notion of average. Like, why is average bad? So we've created these cultures within the testing where it's more punitive than allocating support to those who need support, identifying problems and addressing problems. We're using testing to label, to close schools, to exclude students, and those uses are hugely problematic, especially when the testing we use has become narrower and narrower and impacting what's taught because the entire focus is on a test score and not the bigger picture of learning that it was actually supposed to measure. I think that becomes part of the problem.
All right. So could you please elaborate for our audience? What were the things that we currently do that these tests were supposed to measure?
That we currently do?
Yeah. So like in education, so we're using it punitively, right? So we're supposed to be using these in a way to identify areas that we support, right? So where we can fill in, those gaps.
Right. So, I mean, when you think about it today, right, largely K-12 testing is not beneficial to students and families. They don't get back any level of specificity that allows for study, development, and improvement, right? But that should be the goal of a test, right? You don't give a classroom test and then not tell the kids what they did wrong. You give them feedback. You allow that feedback to direct new study and improvement. Well, large-scale standardized testing is not used in that way, right? So who does it help? It doesn't help the school. The school doesn't get student-level information, doesn't get curricular advice. You're not teaching this topic, and your students did not like. You get broad advice, but one of the problems with standardized test is that you often aren't given the information about where performance actually suffered. I've worked with students where the question asked for X plus 1, they filled in the answer for X. Because the test is designed with a distractor. So you built in a distractor. I picked the distractor because it's a time test and I'm in a hurry and I'm 12. And then I'm penalized for that, right? It's a very strange system that gives poor feedback and incomplete feedback to the theoretical primary users, right? Students, teachers, schools should in theory be the primary users, but they're not, right? They're the ones who are tested upon, who are given the least information about the test. The primary users are state policy members, like school districts and things like that, who are looking at numbers and comparisons to rank and then respond to the rankings, right?
So as you're talking, I'm thinking, should we be surprised by pockets of or increases in cheating when it comes to this culture?
I mean, what there was it Murphy's Law? So if you, I mean, or is it the Coleman principle? I'm confusing which of my theoretical principles it is, right? But once you create this narrow target as the goal, of course we're going to do everything possible to manipulate that, right? State testing is actually a little bit better than admissions testing. I do SAT, ACT, all of those sort of things, because at least when state testing is only given on a 5-point scale, it reduces some of the grubbing for small changes that are less meaningful, right? But still, almost all testing is English and math. Let's just start there, right? All testing that generally counts is English and math. So nothing else in school matters? like that's all we care about, right? That's a very bizarre system to create where all incentives are designed to increase the narrowness of focus. And when schools, students underperform on that narrow focus, we double down on making it narrower, which is bizarre.
And this is where you get into the policy end of it,
Right.
right? So you have more experience than pretty much anybody I know on the policy end. So if you could maybe just give us a little peek behind the curtain on what that looks like. So how are districts and states using this information to drive policy?
Well, when you think about things like Massachusetts is currently, I think they just implemented a ballot initiative to vote as to whether to keep the MCAS as a graduation requirement, right? So when you think about that, should you require a particular score on a fairly narrow standardized test and allow that to override all the performance in the classroom for 4 years? So that was a policy choice to say graduation can be determined, can be stopped by a standardized test, despite what a child does in school for 4 years. There were lots of states that did that. That's fading away. I think we're down to 7 or 8 now that still have a standardized test as a graduation requirement. But just as policy, that says we don't trust teachers. We don't believe in the school system we've created. And rather than fix it, we're going to create this external measure, not evaluation tool, but sort of punitive tool, which is sort of good intentions gone wrong.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm in Virginia, which I think is one of those few states that you were referencing. I believe right now students have to pass 5 state tests in order to graduate, and it's that many because they're including science and history, and so like, is that you brought up, like, well, you don't get tested in history, and so does that mean we don't value it? Does adding more tests in, what are your thoughts on that?
Right? That's where it gets complicated,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because which 5, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we can quibble about which ones, we can argue about what's necessary, what's not. It's hard to do, and America is inherently complicated because a standardized test is inherently un-American. Right? We have state and district run curriculum, but we want a standardized test. How do we have a standardized test if there's no standardized curriculum? There's inherently a conflict there. It would seem bizarre to me. So if you're going to have a standardized test, shouldn't we look for standardized curriculum or vice versa? Because you're forcing this disparate requirement, right? So you're either forcing the curriculum to try to become the test, or you want the test to become the curriculum, but you've never actually said which of the two you want. You're just pretending that the overlap is enough that the problems are solved. So I think there are lots of policies and structural issues that make standardized testing a challenge. Broadening the scope of the test addresses some issues, but it raises others. Now we have more hours of testing in the school year, which becomes more hours of test prep. So now your entire curriculum becomes test prep for those 5 tests.
All right.
That's
So,
learning loss.
yeah. So what are some more equitable ways to approach assessment?
I think one is to recognize that we're in the 21st century, right? And assessment should be broader, should be more thoughtful, should be more wide-ranging. Performance assessments, there are some states that are doing progressive things with performance assessments. In Massachusetts, and in New York, there are consortiums that have been given waivers on state standardized tests and have done performance assessments instead, allowing students to demonstrate more authentic application of the skills that they've learned, which I find to be really interesting, right? But we also have simple solutions like making the test manufacturers, producers, publishers, whatever you want to call them, making them create tests that are actually modern and thoughtful. Imagine if they took the money they have and rather than just returning a score to a school, you got within 5 days of the test, not 5 months, a detailed report that said the student got these questions right. These were the standards that those questions touched on, but these were the types of mistakes they made. Because they're guaranteed to be a student in your classroom who got half the questions wrong because they picked the partial answer, not the incorrect answer. And those partial answers were coded in. If there's a 4-step math problem, it is a requirement to include step 2 and 3 among the answer choice. So the kid who consistently picks step 3, he's not getting things wrong. Well, he's not picking the right bubble, but he's getting it wrong because he's in a hurry, not because he doesn't know it. We have the technology to say that. We just need to take the time, money, and effort to report that to the student and the school and the family, and to recognize that's not the same student as the student who said 1 + 1 is 49. The kid who says 1 + 1 is 1 has a knowledge of math that the kid who says 1 + 1 is 49 does not. And we could report that.
So you said something that I want to follow up on. There's a lot of people that said there's no way we could turn tests around that quickly with the volume of information that there is. So you're saying it's not that we don't have the technology, it's that we choose not to allocate the resources to do that.
I'll asterisk my response with I have never worked behind the curtains at ETS or any of the big testing publishers. So the time it takes them to equate and validate and all of those sort of things, I'll put an asterisk to that and allow the out for that.
Okay.
But I'm not buying that it takes 6 months.
No,
You'd have to walk me through that process to get me to buy that it takes 6 months to return a test when they've used these questions for years, because that's why they claim they don't release the questions, because they want to reuse them. Well, if you reuse them for years, you have hundreds of data points, thousands of data points. What's all the equating and the things that has to happen, and why does it take so long when we've got AI doing all sorts of crazy things and probably writing half their questions, but we don't have that same technology being allocated to return results, more useful, more thoughtful, more complete results to students and families.
all right. So now we've been talking big scale, we're talking standardized tests. Do you have any advice for people who are in the classroom face to face with students every day?
No. I mean, there's so much there. I would, again, I'll put the asterisks. I could throw out some stuff, but I specifically chose not to go into the classroom because I recognized all the restrictions and challenges that teachers face. So I have theoretical thoughts knowing I don't have to deal with the day-to-day challenges of being a teacher, right?
Okay.
That being said, I think for me, what I always want from assessments as a parent who went through this with my kid, right? They took their first standardized test. I'm like, I want the questions. I want to know what my student did right, did wrong. I'd love to be able to know, I know my kids. I could have told you what was like. I didn't need the standardized test to tell me what, like, my son was absolutely going to be the one who picked the partial answer. He's never seen a 2-part question where he's answered both parts of. Right? So it's like, I don't need a test to tell me that. I need a test to tell me the things I don't know when I didn't help him with his homework, all of those sort of things. So if I'm a teacher in a classroom, I'm trying to find ways to give students and parents more information, which means getting more information myself to allow the student's entire support circle to participate in his learning, right? And that's challenging because the test publishers don't want to give up much of that information. So how do we get past that? How do we convey to parents what the test that we've asked their student to take actually means and what they're going to do with that information going forward, right? I think that's the challenge for teachers is and I say, and that's beyond how does that inform your curriculum? As a teacher, if I have to spend 3 hours giving a test to a classroom, I would like that information to be useful.
I completely agree with that.
Like, I just don't know how you drag that information out of the safe deposit box at ETS.
Yeah. So, and I mean, we don't see those results until we no longer have the
Right.
students in front of us that those results are for. So, you know, do we just not even worry about the standardized tests, talk about skills, give narrative, descriptive feedback, and just try and make our students as well-rounded as possible?
I think that's definitely part of it. I mean, you have the standards you have to teach anyway, and you have your curriculum that's sort of predefined for you. I think if you're thinking about statewide assessments, then the challenge is how do you convey the distinction between what you're doing in the classroom and the standardized test performance, right? And the overlap. I want to know as a parent, did the teacher cover this and my kid not get it? Or
Mhm.
did the teacher not cover it? Right? Like, that's something I can do something with. Get him a workbook on this topic. He missed the week we did division, right? Like, all of those things would be useful. And the standardized test doesn't give that information. The teacher sort of gives that information in terms of theoretically how much of the day-to-day curriculum of a classroom is a family able to access, right? That's hard. Like, and adding another layer of overlap that with standardized tests, like, I fully understand there's teachers going, I'm not doing all that damn work. Yes. Yes. Like, I'm not really trying to assign you work. That's why I'm not a principal. Don't blame me. Right.
Yeah.
I don't know how you step around that.
Well, look, the reality is we want what's best for our students, right? We want what's best for their families, and we want to provide the best experience that we possibly can. And, a lot of what you're hitting on is the frustrations that we have in some of these areas. And, I think a lot of people are just struggling with how can we make it useful, or like when,
I have a couple ideas. Actually, now that I'm thinking about it, a couple of maybe useful ideas.
okay,
Find the if you can get your hands on the what's it called? Oh, crap, I just lost the word. There is the technical manual. If you can find technical manual for the test that's going to be given in your classroom, often the descriptive information in technical manuals may be informative when you can't get specific questions.
Mm.
So between sample test and technical manuals, those would be tools I would use to try to better understand the tests that are going to be given to my students, what they say they're testing, and how they structure their questions. And that might be a way to, without adding a ton of work, to give you more information about what's on the test.
You have you've used the word punitive a couple of times when talking about testing, and these high stakes tests are often tied to like accreditation and funding, and it's, to me, seems backwards, right? Like the schools where the kids aren't having any trouble passing these exams get the funding, and if they're struggling for whatever reasons, right, like we haven't necessarily done that deep dive to identify like what's actually causing
Mhm.
these struggles necessarily, they like lose accreditation, they lose autonomy, and they lose funding. Is there any place in the policy work that anyone is doing, whether it's your work or others, in considering that aspect of like, let's at least use the information to give support where it's needed?
Not that I can recall. And that's the big challenge and problem with a lot of how high stakes assessments are used. Right, I'm with you. Like, it would seem to me that you would line up districts by the income of families, right? You line up districts by test performance the previous year, and you allocate funding in inverse proportion.
Mm-hmm.
And when a school underperforms, you don't close them and restart, because everything they've learned is now lost. Right? Talk about learning loss. Fire half the staff, you've lost all the experience of those teachers, you've lost all the knowledge of those leaders. Like, that seems to be creating learning loss, right? Re-upping contracts with a different test provider every 2 years, and then pretending that we can look backwards and compare those tests where the nuances are different. So I think often what we end up doing is creating policies that don't start from a growth mindset. I hate all the tag words, right? Like, but don't have a growth mindset. Like, rather than fire all the people who are there, let's add staff to improve the results, not remove staff.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that doesn't occur broadly, right? Largely, it's punitive. It's, if your scores are low, we're firing all the people, we're closing the school, we're sending the students to other places, and you're simply moving problems to different areas without actually addressing or solving them. So yeah, there's not a ton. I can't think of any single district or state that has what I would call a smart, thoughtful, progressive testing policy that uses tests to identify problem areas and then implement solutions for that. Right? But that, to me, would be the ideal, that testing would be using a thermometer. They often like to make the thermometer comparison, right? Like that, which makes me laugh, because no one uses a thermometer and then says the person's sick, so don't give them medicine.
Right.
So when we say get rid of testing, they're like, that's like throwing away a thermometer. No, it's not, because you've been using it wrong, right? We're saying stop using the thermometer wrong, and then when you find out they're sick, you take away the medicine, right? So to me, like, you have to diagnose a problem, get experts in to not simply say these are symptoms, try to find the cause and then treat the cause. We aren't doing any of those things, right? We're diagnosing a problem and then penalizing people for having the problem.
Yeah.
So
put that on a shirt.
Yeah, seriously. So, well, Akil, it has been an absolute pleasure. Got a ton of information from you. So do you have any last thoughts? How can people connect with you? Where can they find you and what you do?
Well, my day job is at FairTest, and I'm often found doing things there. I'm also on most of the social things. I'm still on Twitter, despite it circling the drain. I'm Akil Bello. There's not but one of me in the United States, as far as I can tell, so I'm not hard to find. LinkedIn, Twitter, all of those sort of things.
Awesome.
All right. Well, hey, thank you very much for joining us. This was an awesome way to kick off our GBG live stream. So we will be back here every month, first Sunday every month at 8 p.m. Eastern. Our next guest is going to be Dr. Kelsey Reed. So she does a lot with asset-based education. So that's going to be another phenomenal conversation. Once again, we would like to thank our sponsor, Got Feedback. So this platform is an awesome way to give that narrative descriptive feedback in a way that's kind of seamless in the classroom, so we can have those conversations with families and it's not too burdensome. So once again, we'd like to thank our guest, Akil Bello.
Thank you.
Reach out to him. All right, everybody, have a great night.